Alright, Splatters, Splatoon Raiders is here, and it's pushing the franchise into full looter-shooter on this one. It also introduces a bunch of new mechanics and playstyles, so whether you're a Splatoon veteran or this is your first time with this series, here's some tips and tricks to help you out along the way. Okay, so we're going to start off with some basic beginner tips. My biggest tip out of the gate is don't focus all your energy on just one tank. Splatoon Raiders introduces 3 tank types: speed, power, and tactical. These tanks also define the gadgets you're able to use as well. At first, you can use one gadget until being able to upgrade and use 2 gadgets, and who knows, maybe there's an upgrade down the line that introduces some other surprises as well. Each tank and the gadgets you can use with those tanks encourage very different playstyles. Here's the thing though, I would encourage you to diversify your tank usage and experiment with gadgets often. The more you use a specific tank, the more it levels up. And if you focus too much time on one tank, you risk getting in a situation not well suited for your favorite tank later on, which will result in you having to change your tanks and use different gadgets to approach different sorts of situations. If you've spent too much time in one tank and suddenly have to switch up to another one, you risk using a less developed tank with less developed and optimized gadgets. And this, of course, can result in you having to grind from earlier levels to get those tanks up to snuff. Personally, I do not believe there's a one-size-fits-all tank and gadget combination, and as you enter certain raids that focus on specific enemy types, you'll start to learn what gadget is best against a certain kind of horde, especially as some raids focus on throwing one specific kind of enemy at you non-stop. So I encourage you to switch tanks and gadgets often. That being said, my other tip is I would say, in general, just get out of your comfort zone. There's a chance you're completely new to Splatoon, and if that's the case, welcome. But also, get ready for lots and lots of different weapon types that all act very differently from one another. You have your core weapons like shooters, platanas, and dualies, but some weapons are a bit of an odder fit here in Raiders compared to the multiplayer games like rollers, which are great in multiplayer to lay a path down for your teammates, but don't quite make as much sense in the case of Splatoon Raiders' horde-like design. Still, I encourage you to mess around and give weapons like rollers a shot, because weapons like rollers in particular have a lot of variety and can actually offer a higher skill ceiling than they first put on. Brellas are my personal favorite due to a single shot laying a long path ahead, and unleashing the Brella into a crowd of salmonoids just never ceases to feel good. But again, like tanks and gadgets, there isn't really a one-size-fits-all. There's definitely going to be weapons you're using more frequently than others, but in looter-shooter-like design, the game also has a way of introducing new weapons to you that are higher levels that do more damage than the weapon you've grown very attached to. And in that way, it is a natural sort of nudge to try something out, and you should. Alright, in the bigger, more explorative levels, you'll be collecting compasses. When you get a compass, it'll appear at the top of your screen when looking at the overworld map. Pay attention to them, because when you follow them, they unlock sampler dungeons. Sampler dungeons operate like short trial dungeons as well as challenges for gadgets. Sometimes certain challenges will strip gear away to make you think differently about a given situation. Completing a sampler dungeon unlocks a skill point to power up one of your attributes: max HP, weapon damage, gadget damage, and increases gadget slots. These skill points are otherwise only unlocked by leveling. At first, sampler dungeons can feel like optional content, but they're really not. By the time I got to the end game, I found myself returning to all of the ones I didn't do in order to build myself up to take on some of the game's final gauntlets. So yes, you're not required to complete them to progress, and they don't have a level attached to them, but they will help you out in the long run, I promise. They're also just incredible tutorials and making you rethink how gadgets can be used, showing inventive and cool methods to overcome all sorts of challenges. Alright, Ruin Raids. You know what these are when they appear on your map with 3 chests, each chest signifying a different tank. This means you have to complete these Ruin Raids with each individual tank in order to unlock all the necessary gear and loot you can get from it. And yes, going back to my first tip, You guessed it, you should absolutely just do these. You'll notice that when you complete a ruin raid, a check mark will appear over the tank emblem you completed it with. I'd suggest just clearing all 3 out at once, as it'll better set you up for the future by positioning you to change your tank routinely and get used to different gear and strategies. I think this is just a really clever design incentive and one to pay attention to. Okay, so as the game progresses, you'll unlock Spicy Raids. Spicy Raids are older levels, but with the difficulty turned up a notch. Admittedly, when I was first working through this game, I did not partake in doing the Spicy Raids. And by the time I got to the end game, I kind of realized that was a mistake. Like the sampler dungeons, you will need to go back and do these one way or another to level yourself up. Unlike the sampler dungeons, I wouldn't say these are as required, but I have a real hard time seeing how you're going to be powerful enough to take on some of the final levels without having done at least a few of these. On the topic of going back to old levels, now let's talk about treasure hunting and collecting. Compasses that unlock sampler dungeons can be found in the bigger explorative levels that I mentioned. If you happen to complete one of these levels and notice you missed finding one, thankfully you can hop back in, and when you find it, along with any of the other collectibles like briny maps, you don't need to complete the level in order to have gathered them. So once you find them, you can just leave anytime after that, and you still get the loot you gathered up until that moment. In general, there's a treasure list to get a better overview of the levels and what you're missing or the reward you get by completing them. This comes in extra handy towards the end game when you'll inevitably have to revisit older levels to buff yourself up. Alongside compasses and maps, you will be accumulating crystals. Crystals are the major currency in the game that allows you to upgrade your gear, among many other things. And there's a few tricks to keep in mind when crystal farming. Scrapping gear is the best way, and trust me, you should do it a lot. But another way to get crystals is hang out in the crystal gathering stages. In these levels, you have to collect eggs which then power up your drill to drill into crystals. However, you can hang out in those levels far beyond the completion point of your ready drill. By doing so, crystals reappear throughout the stage, allowing you to continuously drill into them over and over again. Of course, not without having to take on hordes of salmonoids again, but it's fun, so why wouldn't you? On the topic of collecting eggs, yeah, egg farming is also something you'll have to do, sometimes under a very intense time crunch. Alright, this next section isn't necessarily any tips and tricks, but more like reminders or things to look out for when looking through your weapons. Weapon organization is a thing. You'll be comparing and contrasting all sorts of weapons all the time, so different levels, different rarities, and with many guns sometimes featuring totally different attributes. So it's important to remember that higher level doesn't mean it's a better gun. I personally found it most useful to organize guns by type. That way, if I was looking for a specific gun, I didn't have to search through a sea of them, I can just look through the type and see what levels they were at. Additionally, ZL on the controller cycles through weapon attributes and also make it a lot easier to compare damage and all that jazz to other weapons. Another tip is that you can lock guns in place. This helps especially with scrapping guns, as well as organizing weapons and making sure your favorites are always at the top and you don't scrap them on accident. Alright, mod assigning for gadgets. There is a ton of mods, many of which you'll be looting along the way. And this is where the real tinkering comes into play. Splatoon Raiders does have a nifty feature where you can just hit the plus button and it'll auto-assign these attributes to your gadgets. But just be careful because it often assigns something that wasn't really vibing with how I played, which is an example of just how deep and flexible the gadget mods are. Even if you're really in tune with how a gadget works, there's still a lot of room and depth to completely change how one functions. Anyways, that's it. Welcome to Splatoon Raiders. Hopefully this gets you ready for the game, and if there's any tips you think I missed or maybe certain builds that you think are really good,